Just begin whenever.
As long as it's in the next 30 seconds.
All right. Good evening. Have you ever thought that you've been treated unfairly? Maybe you tried out for the All-Star team, but you didn't get the position because the coach's son was on the team, and he got the position, even though you knew you were a better player. Or maybe you tried out for the speech and debate team, and you weren't made captain because the person who was a teacher's pet, even though you knew that you got better grades and were a better arguer than that person. This is an example of discrimination. I'm here tonight to argue that affirmative action detrimentally affects those who it's supposed to serve. I will do this by showing that affirmative action leads to reverse discrimination, which in turn leads to minority students lowering their expectations to fulfill a job requirement or to enroll in an institution, which also ultimately leads to their failure. First, I'll define some terms. Negatively affects means to effect in a harmful way. Serves means those to whom it's supposed to benefit. Non-minority is a group that is not well represented or that is not represented or underrepresented. That is not underrepresented. Unrepresented means to have insufficient representation, and insufficient means to have lacking, to be lacking or not enough. Reverse. My first point: reverse discrimination. Affirmative action leads to meeting quotas. These quotas might say that we need to have a certain amount of Hispanics, a certain amount of African Americans, and a certain amount of white kids in an institution or a job fulfillment. Now, say that most of the applicants to college, such as Cal Poly, are white, and say that a small minority of them are Hispanic and African American. Well, to meet certain requirements, the school might say that, oh, well, even though this student scored a little bit higher than, say, a Hispanic student, we don't have enough Hispanic students to create a diversity or to economically benefit them. I can use an example of in Michigan in 2008, Asian students were discriminated against from the University of Michigan for medical school because of their test scores. They were seen as too populous in it. According to Dr. Cook at UCSD in 2008, affirmative action acceptance has had an average MCAT that places them in the lowest 2% relative to the MCAT distribution of the other students accepted on average overall GPA that places them in the lowest 6% relative to the overall GPA distribution of students accepted. The students accepted were of African American descent, while the students rejected who had a higher GPA and a higher MCAT score were Asian. Moving on to the second point, it lowers the expectations of the job requirement. An example of this is in 2009, a case was taken to the U.S. Supreme Court on discrimination in a firehouse. 4 white firemen accused the state of not promoting them based on their ethnicity. The test that they took based on their promotion was thrown out the door, and promotions were given to other minority students. The reason why the test was thrown out was because not enough minority applicants were being promoted and did not pass the test. So that is another example on why. Also, moving on to the third point, that this ultimately leads to failures. In a study by Richard Standard at UCLA, a law professor, he noticed a trend. He said after the first year of law school, 51% of black students in the bottom tenth of are in the bottom 10th compared with 5% of white students. About 2/3 of black students are in the bottom 1/5 of the class. He also goes on to remark that without racial preferences, 14% fewer blacks would be accepted, but that those accepted would be far more successful because they weren't always constantly being brought down. This study was done in 2001, I believe. Yes, 2001. So, based on what I've said, affirmative action, I'm sorry. Based off what I said, affirmative action leads to reverse discrimination, which in turn gives positions that should be filled by qualified people to people who might be less qualified. And the people who accept these positions as less qualified are not inherently able to fulfill them to the fullest potential. You can't say that someone who has high GPA isn't qualified to fulfill something such as engineering, which is a highly competitive field and is indeed impacted here at the school. To accept someone of a lower caliber than someone with a 4.0 would be detrimental to that person because they would not be able to fulfill the course requirements, namely the calculus, the science, and the engineering courses needed to be a successful engineer. This in turn would be detrimental to society as a whole, considering that engineers make up most of what we physically see around us, including structures, computers, chemical items we use every day, such as iPhones. Prescription medications that we use are made both by engineers and doctors. So, affirmative action doesn't help the people it's supposed to help by getting them into school and giving them that first push. It ultimately sets them up to failure. Thank you.
Okay, I like the opening with the rhetorical question, the hypothetical, that's fine. You do identify the claim. The phrasing on it is a little bit awkward. I think you need something a little more direct. The main points, though, are clearly laid out, and you set up a chain of arguments that we're going to be following, and you're pretty consistent about citing those points as we go through the speech, although on a couple of the points you're not really labeling them as claims, but they're just topic areas, and we have to figure out what the inferences are as you're going through those points, especially on the first point. After that, I thought you did a better job on those kinds of things. The supporting information, you had a good example with the University of Michigan test scores. You had some data about the distribution based on the MCATs that people had taken. I thought you had some interesting data on the law school performance on those particular groups. There's always the inference, though, that the performance of the students in the classes, maybe that is largely affected by their ethnicities, and maybe they're being discriminated against and you're measuring the wrong thing. I think that that's a legitimate question to raise. If you're going to use objective test standards, then that's what we need to have. How do we measure those test standards? I think there's an assumption here that quotas are somehow accepted when I'm not sure that that's the case. Typically, for instance, like in the firehouse example, you find court rulings that are specific to the circumstances where there might be a requirement to, like you said, throw out the results of the particular test. That's often done in the context of a specific jurisdiction where there has been a problem. I don't know what's going on in this particular example that you gave because you're kind of giving us a paraphrase of that situation rather than a clearer explanation of the example itself. I thought you explained your concepts pretty well. On the presentations, you got stuck in a couple of points. Sometimes I don't think it flowed as smoothly as it could be, but you usually recovered and made a pretty clear explanation. All right, thank you.